Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Live from New York at the epicentre of technology in the COVID crisis, Lockie Andrews, CIO and Chief Digital Officer for retailer UNTUCKit, is my special guest. We talk about the history of this fast-growing apparel retailer, starting online and then with a single store in Soho growing to now 85 locations in the US, Canada, and the UK. Lockie describes operating during the COVID crisis and how as a venture-backed, digitally native brand, they moved early and are seeing sales success online. Finally, she shares her 3 top tips or pillars on getting through the crisis and the months ahead. Next, Steve Burrows, CEO and co-founder of Reshift Media, joins me as we delve into the latest COVID-era consumer media and social media platform behaviors, and Steve parses the data to come up with solid action strategies and tactics for both essential and non-essential retailers. But first, let's jump right into my conversation with Lockie Andrews from UNTUCKit. Lockie, welcome to The Voice of Retail. Let me start off by asking you, are you safe? Are everything well? How are you doing today?
I am good, and thank you so much for having me. I am in the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis here in New York City, safe and sound, fortunately, and sheltering in place, but I am well.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I was thinking when I was looking at your background that you were in New York City. So as you said, the epicenter. So be safe and know that we're all thinking of the folks at New York. It's not your first brush at adversity, but it's a strong city. So come out of it well in the fullness of time. Listen, tell us. Thanks for joining me. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your personal professional journey, and your role at UNTUCKit, and about UNTUCKit and about yourself.
Absolutely. I am currently the Chief Digital Officer of UNTUCKit. I've been working with the brand for about 2 years, and I came to the company because I also have a consulting firm, Catalyst Consulting. That's how I met UNTUCKit. As they embarked on their digital transformation journey, they asked me to come in and help supervise and manage and track their path forward. And I've been doing digital transformation, honestly, for the last 15 years in many different forms, but obviously full steam now. I've always known that I wanted to work in the epicenter of more technology. And I felt New York City was that place to focus on it. There's so many bright minds, so many great industries here, from finance to retail to insurance to, consumer products, all within this area. And my background, I started out on Wall Street. So I actually have a very atypical background for this business. But in working on Wall Street, I recognized that making widgets, as it were, whatever that widget is, was something that I did not know how to do. I went to school to study finance, and coming out of it, I wanted to actually work at a retailer. So I actually went back to business school to figure that out. So after attending Harvard Business School and talking to some of the brightest minds in the world, understanding how I could leverage my skill set. And ultimately, I am my superpower, if you will, one of them at least, is being able to unite and commercialize ideas. So in addition to understanding creativity, I also obviously bring a very strong business sense. And so sitting between those two worlds was really what I was very good at. And adding that advent of technology as that third leg to my superpower, understanding how to apply technology in those situations. So I've worked with a whole host of companies, most of them venture capital or private equity backed, who want to scale at a hyper growth rate, and understanding how to do that at scale cost effectively. And in working with Sun Capital for several years, actually, interestingly, during the Great Recession, hopefully we're not entering into the next recession, but time to tell. But working with Sun Capital and their consumer, and then ultimately all of their companies during that time period, allowed me to develop a playbook of how you can come into a brand that is under stress of some sort, and then understand how to turn it around. And ultimately, after working now with over 100 companies through my own consulting firm, through relationships in the private equity and venture capital community, I've developed that playbook in understanding how to apply the best of whatever that brand stands for from a positioning and value proposition, and turning that into growth. So everyone from a Kate Spade acquisition at Liz Claiborne to being the chief operating officer at Tadashi, I've been doing this for a while, and definitely am well honed in understanding difficult and new situations and how to make the most out of it.
Well, you're going to need to add a chapter, or you're going to be able to add a whole new chapter to turning businesses around and understanding tumultuous change. But it sounds like living the way you do at this intersection of technology, finance, and consulting and private equity. I can't think of anyone better qualified from that perspective. It's a great background. Tell us about the transition to UNTUCKit. I came across that brand. I was actually in New York City I host retail tours in New York City for Canadian executives, and I came across the brand, and lo and behold, the friend I was with or my colleague said, "Oh, I love that brand," and he was wearing your product. I had not heard of it a couple of years ago, and now you're in Canada, and I believe some of the top selling physical stores were actually here in Canada. I'm a customer myself, so tell us a bit about the brand for those who are not as familiar with it as I might be.
Absolutely. UNTUCKit was started by our founders who are still involved in the business, which I'm happy to say. And it was a simple premise. They designed the perfect shirt to be untucked. And at that moment in time, 9 years ago, that was something that was not necessarily well now known, at least in the United States. And so having perfected the shirt over the course of the first 3 years, they were mostly online. And I think staying close to the consumer was really the smart thing that they did in the beginning, and leveraging that opportunity to connect with customers through customer service online is the way the brand was able to develop and perfect themselves before they reached the quote unquote national scale. And so once they got there, opening the first store in Soho, which is amazing given that was only 3 or 4 years ago, to see the growth now with 85 stores across the United States. As you mentioned, we are in Canada, one of our best performing markets, and recently opened stores in the UK with an expansion internationally soon thereafter. And so the brand is really resonated with a consumer literally from ages 20 to 60, which is great. But I think it's more of a mindset. Because of the commercialization and casualization that is happening amongst all of us, right? And why the WeWork and the gig culture has really taken off, the dress code has also evolved. And the shirt arrived right at the perfect time to support that, so that you can show up and be professional and polished, but still be a little casual in your approach and being different in mindset. And I think that's really the beauty of the product. So in addition to the men that we serve, because it is mostly a button-down shirt environment, we also supply polos and crews and jackets. So the brand is definitely expanding. And because we've discovered that 50% of the time, it's actually a female in that purchasing decision, whether buying a gift or buying for herself, because we've launched a capsule collection for women. The brand is definitely evolving organically. And so after 9 years now, to see this brand at the heights that it is very humbling for the founders and for myself to see how well our consumers have received us.
Your brand story is familiar to me. I was with Levi's in the late 90s during the big Dockers craze, if you remember that. Kind of the right product at the right time with the right trend, business trend. And I think you nailed it as a product line, as a brand story, because, we were all looking for, speaking on behalf of the whole men gig economy, a shirt that wasn't like, you wanted to be casual, but, shirts were just too long. And when I found it, it was like an epiphany for me. It's like about half a dozen of them, because they had quality to them, right? They were a quality shirt that was cut just the way it should have been. Now, I know there's a big online business. So you talked about digital transformation. Is that a big component of your business? Of course, a lot of digital companies are investing in physical stores. I was in your Soho. That's where I first came to know your brand. But that was a big step forward 4 years ago. Now it seems like it certainly seems the right thing to do at the time and today. But digital, it must be a pretty big component of the business, right?
Absolutely. And since the brand was born online for the first few years, we've kept that digital first mindset throughout. And after the stores, and interestingly, we're currently at 60% online, 40% of revenue driven offline, which is very interesting. And I think we all believe in the beauty of the omni-channel model, which is why, from a technology perspective, we've been leading into designing that next generation tech stack so that we can exploit those opportunities for omni omni-channel because the customer is pretty seamless, right? So I think starting out, we as retailers and those who worked in the industry were definitely seeing these as siloed experiences, but definitely nowadays, and with the advent of iPhones and other mobile devices, we've been able to, from a consumer perspective, not see any differences between those channels, right? It's completely seamless and we bounce back and forth. So I think for us as a brand, we want to keep that digital first mindset, but recognize that for a new customer, maybe he wants to come into the store to try on the shirt. And we facilitate try-ons in store, making sure we always have something in stock for someone to try on. We call them our try-on shirts so that he can find his fit. And if he's comfortable purchasing there in that environment, but we have many customers who come in once they know their size, they're online, they never come into our stores again. Or maybe they come in for a shot of whiskey because we try to do that as well. But ultimately, we want the consumer to tell us what they prefer, not for us to necessarily steer them to any particular channel.
And that was my story, actually. Sample of one. I went in, wasn't sure of the fit, so I went in and tried one on, and then my replenishment has been online. So I'm kind of the epitome of that. Well, so let's fast forward to current state, the business as unusual that we're all living in. What's the state of the retail nation today? I imagine the stores are closed, but online is still open. Give us just a snapshot of the business as it sits today in early April.
Absolutely. Our COVID-19 response, I'd say we are definitely with some of the leaders who went first in deciding to close our stores. Though we're venture capital backed and very lean and very conscious of every dollar, though that wasn't necessarily the most financially prudent decision at that point in time, we felt we did not want to put our store associates on the front line. We, at that point in time, dating back to March 13th, when all of this really started to happen, we just weren't feeling confident about the future. There was so many uncertainties. So that weekend is when we decided to close our stores. And I think our sales associates felt very good about that, right? I think ultimately, and that's where we sit now with our entire fleet closed, it allowed for us to do all the pivot and response activities and to make sure our business continuity plans, because we also, of course, during that time remotely at our headquarters started to move into this new environment where we'd be sheltering in place and working from home. So that really was a big undertaking. But the great thing, again, about being at a small, nimble, digitally native brand is we had all of that infrastructure. So that wasn't necessarily a big change for us. And fortunately, the online channel has remained to be strong. So we're proud of our loyalty of our best customers who still enjoy our product. And so we are fortunately in a position where our distribution center is also still working. So we've had very little supply chain disruption. I am very encouraged by that, despite some of the news that's happening, and it is happening in a safe way. So those quote unquote essential workers being the down to the delivery people and the post office and exactly. And FedEx and USPS and UPS, they're still moving product for us. And so because of that, we've been able to take what could have been a disastrous experience to be 100% closed and at least have that channel still flexing and still capturing some of the demand that is now moved online.
Right. And you're already at 60/40. So you're, as you said, digitally native brand that was already executing well, already had a good platform to launch from. So congratulations on that. That kind of platform and work doesn't happen overnight. So congratulations on being ready for that.
Thank you.
Ready for the unexpected, right? Ready to move in bad weather. I was reading you wrote an article, the retailers and brands 3 steps to survive the Corona apocalypse. So, great article. Take us through that article and your advice to retailers who are listening, and what are your 3 kind of tips that you put in for surviving and being ready for the great reboot, as I've called it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking about that. I really wrote this from the perspective of just looking at my team. I'd say working at a mostly millennial organization, this would be their first time going through this. And so what I wanted to instill is that we've been through this before, right?
Yeah.
In different ways. And obviously every single, pandemic that happens, every single recession that happens has different root causes. And while those are different, the processes that you have and your reaction plan is typically similar. And so as I alluded to, having worked during the Great Recession with Sun Capital and helping their companies weather that storm that came on what felt at that time suddenly, this is even more sudden, obviously. And so maybe we should have known about it a little bit long before we actually started to react. I'll leave that for other people to debate. But ultimately for us, this really came as a shock. We went from peak to trough, like extremely quickly, having our best sales days to all of a sudden having a halt in the business. And
we all saw it coming. I remember I read a report for the Retail Council of Canada. And I talked to a bunch of CEOs in early February, and at the time it was concerns about supply chain. But then there was starting to be, what if this comes here? And you just can't imagine that, that from mid-February, a month later to this cessation of all retail, like it's the ferocity of the speed. You see trouble coming, but you could, it's just hard to imagine this, you just basically pull the plug. What do you advise?
Absolutely. So obviously, the first thing is not to, as some members of society, as well as individuals on my team, you can't be paralyzed by this. And so though your initial inclination is to just stop and react, I'd say actually react, but act, right? Act deliberately. And so the first pillar was to make sure you had a plan. And at that point in time, surprisingly, many companies did not have a business continuity plan. And so thinking with a level and clear-headed mind about some specific steps that would need to happen over the course. And for us, closing stores, making sure we had a remote policy, making sure everyone had what they need to operate in the next few months. The second is to then really start planning out, well, what are we going to do? How will these operations continue to proceed? And again, a lot of these characteristics, exactly the same initial reactions that we had during the Great Recession, and understanding what does that planning mean? And it means making sure from a financial perspective that you are covered. As a result, there will be things that you need to do, and those things are quite simple. Obviously, looking at cash and liquidity, and this was before the government, at least here in the United States, started to formulate their plan. But without that plan, how are you going to survive as a company? How are you going to meet payroll? How are you going to pay your suppliers and vendors? And then ultimately, as you set out that plan, and again, the very specific tactical things that you need to do, building a cash flow analysis, making sure you're not tripping covenants in your loans, making sure you've reached out and if you can extend payables, have those hard conversations, but then also understanding, do you need to have furloughs? Do you need to do layoffs as a result of your store base being closed? When would those happen? Are you covered? Do you have the legal advice? So planning those things out at the moment while you're acting is also important. And then ultimately be making sure you're there, the third pillar, to lead. We're still humans at the end of the day. We all have our initial reactions, but showing up for your employees, for your investors, for all the key stakeholders, and showing that leadership that we've been here before, we will come out of this on the other side. We may not know what it is. We may not have control, but showing that you as a leader will lead everyone through this, and we will do that intact. So that was the article, and it's had great reception because I think it came out very early when people were still in that fear mode in the paralysis moment. And now we've seen our way through all three of those steps.
Well, it is a nice cogent kind of snapshot. Of course, there's much depth behind it of an action plan. And I've been talking to many retailers, and they're kind of getting past this first phase of, these daily shocks, right? The store's closed. I got to lay off employees. There's new government programs. And they're now settling into this business as unusual phase. However, this lasts weeks, months probably. And then what does it look like when it starts up again? So it's a nice cogent document to kind of get you set and ready to go. If people want to get in touch with you and learn a bit more about you or your consulting side of your business, how do they do that?
Yes, I keep things simple. Lockie Andrews, and that's on Twitter, that's LinkedIn, that's Instagram, and also my website. So either of them will work.
Well, Lockie, I wanted to thank you for being on The Voice of Retail. I was actually, we were supposed to have an in-person interview at Shop Talk. I was very much looking forward to meeting you in person, but I wanted to thank you again for joining me virtually as we do these things today, and hopefully I look forward to meeting you in person after this. But once again, thanks for being on the Voice of Retail and sharing your insights with my listeners.
Thank you so much for having me, and stay safe, please.
Hi, it's Jim Okamura, partner at Macmillan Doolin and co-founder of Global E-Commerce Leaders Forum. We are very excited to announce the latest extension to the Global E-Commerce Leaders Forum events, the Global E-Commerce Tech Talks podcast. In partnership with Kent Allen, Scott Silverman, and our host Michael LeBlanc, we'll be debuting and discussing custom proprietary research designed specifically for global e-commerce retailers and talking to e-commerce industry leaders around the world to help us sharpen our saw blades when it comes to doing business across borders. Check out the 1-minute trailer episode available now. Apple and Spotify Plus, all major podcast platforms with episodes debuting every 2 weeks.
Steve, welcome to The Voice of Retail. How are you doing? Everyone safe? Everything good?
Yeah, I'm doing very good. Thanks for having me today there, Mike.
Well, my pleasure. You and I have known each other for a long time. We've worked together. It's been my pleasure to gain insights from you over these many years. You're one of the top-ranked speakers at Retail Council of Canada events, so it's such a treat for me to have you on the podcast. But for the listeners who may not be as familiar, certainly as I am, with you and with Kirk and with the team, give us a sense of your personal, professional journey and a bit about Reshift.
Sure, happy to do so. I've been in the digital media space since the early 90s. Back when we used terms like new media and interactive, which I don't want to call you out, Mike, but I know you remember those too. So, I started in the news category originally, working for a few news organizations, and then branched out into retail thereafter. And then myself and my business partner, Kirk, we started Reshift, I think about 7 or so years ago now, going off memory. And the reason we started it was that we saw that multi-location retail in particular was an area of just explosive digital growth. So we decided to start Reshift, which is basically a digital marketing organization specifically aimed at retail organizations. And we do everything from social media, SEO, we build websites, we build apps, basically any form of digital advertising, digital marketing.
And it's CanWest, to bring up a name from our collective past. You, me, and Kirk all worked at CanWest Media back when it was the media day. So that's when your paths, we all started to kind of intersect. We were talking about this matrix moment that we're having where, we all live in a simulation. I think we've figured that out. But look at the data on the screen. And many, many people, the vast majority of people, see a bunch of numbers moving down a screen, but you see trends. And I wanted to talk about that. So you've been combing through the data for your clients and the industry and yourself, trying to figure out, what's happening in terms of consumer behavior online during the COVID crisis, this first or entering in the second phase of the COVID crisis. Tell us what you're seeing. Let's start with any stats around media consumption, and then we can talk about what's happening on how people are using the platforms.
Sure, happy to do so. Not surprisingly, with people working from home now and, everyone trying to interact remotely, digital media consumption overall worldwide is up dramatically. It's like 70% worldwide, similar sort of trend here in Canada. A few interesting nuances within that, though. So no surprise, streaming services like Netflix and Disney Plus are way up, as you'd expect, as people are watching more TV at home. But there's a few interesting little items in there. One is that mobile use is actually up 30 to 50%, depending on the market.
That's counterintuitive to me, right? Why would mobile be used when we're all at home?
Exactly, right? That's one of those interesting little factoids where people are using the phone sitting on their couch. So a lot of people, particularly in the business world, think of going online as using a laptop or a desktop computer still. But your general consumer, they interact with the internet more via their phone. So as their use goes up overall, they are using that phone, and often in a multitasking sort of fashion. So they may be sitting on the couch, maybe Netflix is running in the background on the TV, but they're on their phone and they're multitasking. They're on Facebook or they're reading the news or whatever it happens to be. So a lot of multitasking going on. And yeah, counterintuitively, you're exactly right. Mobile use is trending upwards a little bit.
Interesting. And it's already so high, right? That's what's interesting to me is mobile use is already so high that it's even being further accelerated. You and I have been talking about this moment in our lives as the great acceleration, right? Those trends that were already evident, particularly in digital, are just like zooming ahead so to speak, in a number of years. Like what we thought was going to take 18 months to 2 years is happening in days and weeks. So let's talk about how people are using the big platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Google. What's going on in those big platforms?
Yeah, so anything to do with communication has skyrocketed. So social media is up anywhere from 20 to 30% here in Canada, depending on which platform and how you look at it. Instant messaging, which was already a juggernaut in terms of time spent, that would be things like Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. That's up 30%. And I can't tell you how massive a number that is because the number one digital activity people do is actually instant messaging in terms of sheer volume. So the fact that that's up 30% is enormous. Even old school email is up 15%. And that just speaks to the fact that people are really craving the ability to connect, right? Because we can't connect physically anymore. We're not going into work. We're not getting together in social situations the way we used to. So any kind of digital connection and communication, it's absolutely skyrocketed.
For the audience at home, for the listeners, so to speak, let's pivot to the business aspect of this. So, much of what you said, many would personally be experiencing or would assume. But, when I think about trends that were evident before, for example, it was tough as a brand to do a lot of organic marketing or organic messaging. It was tough to get traction with that. Paid advertising was getting expensive. I mean, some have described it almost as a utility. You got to do it, but maybe you don't benefit because everybody's doing it. What's going on in that space? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting trend we are seeing because let's start with social media. So volume is way up, as I just mentioned, Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn to an extent. But historically, from a non-paid perspective, so doing organic posts on Facebook or Instagram, those weren't particularly effective in terms of reaching your target audience. As we all know, Facebook's been metering back the reach of brands for some time. Right. It's kind of almost turned into a bit of a customer service medium as opposed to an acquisition or connection or communications medium per se. However, in this particular time, people are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter more than ever. But there's been a bit of a pullback by advertisers at the same time. Not surprisingly, a lot of companies are looking to preserve cash. Their sales are probably down, so they're not looking to dump a bunch of money into advertising currently. So you have this interesting relationship between an increase in time spent by consumers, but a decrease in advertising. And people are thirsty for things to pass the time. They suddenly have a little more time on their hands, and they're looking for entertainment and information from social networks. So from a brand perspective, we are seeing a bit of a resurgence in terms of the effectiveness of non-paid social media, particularly Instagram and Facebook, which are the ones where people really spend dedicated time, more so than maybe a Twitter where it's more in and out. So we are seeing that as a brand, there is an opportunity to stay in touch with existing customers as opposed to maybe thinking of Facebook as an acquisition tool right now. Think of it as a keeping in touch with my existing customers tool, which means you can now viably use Facebook and Instagram to actually stay in touch with people through maybe things like interesting videos or keeping them up to date in terms of new developments you have as an organization. I would kind of stay away from we hope everyone's doing safe during this COVID-19 situation. We're kind of past that. Start thinking about how you can interact and sort of entertain people, obviously pertinent to your brand, but in a really sort of organic way.
One of the things I wanted to talk about when you look at China, it was already a market where live streaming, both from individuals and brands, was already evident, and that's just been accelerated dramatically. Do you think that is the case here? I mean, live streaming, we kind of thought that was a few years away. You saw a little bit of it, but you really didn't see brands doing much of it, certainly not in the way that you see in China. Do you think that's going to advance? And would you advise what are you telling your clients? You start live streaming, interviews with designers. Is that viable now? Do you think that makes sense?
I do. And in fact, we've been experimenting with a couple of live streaming concepts for some time. So Facebook does obviously these Facebook Lives, which is a live video stream via Facebook. Instagram does the same thing. We've done this successfully with clients even previous to COVID-19, but we have been doing a lot more of it since because, again, people are looking for entertainment. You can't watch live sports anymore. That's gone. So people are looking and craving that. And we're seeing spikes across the board on any kind of streaming service like a Netflix or even general terrestrial TV usage is up. Like people are craving that. So there is now, I think, a real opportunity for brands to think about interesting and engaging topics and do live streaming. Of course, record it and use it as a video for posting socially thereafter, even to YouTube if you're so inclined. But yes, I absolutely believe that there's a real opportunity there.
Well, and it's a nice segue into kind of some overall advice I'd love to hear for the retailers listening. I'm starting to think, I've been thinking about this in 3 phases. Phase 1 is this daily shocks that we've been going through for the past month. And, store closes, you're essential, you're non-essential. You're doing curbside, you're out of business, you're in business. We're now kind of moving into what I've called the business as unusual phase. And this could last many, many months, depending. It won't always be like this, but it's always going to be like something. What are you advising your clients to start doing? You've touched on it a little bit in terms of, keeping connected. And earlier you talked about using search less for acquisition than retention. But in general, what are you advising your clients on how to proceed in their space in terms of keeping in touch with their clients and what their core business strategy should be executed or articulated in the digital realm?
Yeah, so it's very much depends on the business itself, obviously. So if I can sort of hive it off into 2 pieces, there's one where you are some sort of an essential service, you're in grocery or you're selling hand sanitizer or whatever it is, and your sales are still strong. If you're in that scenario, now is the time to make hay. So you should be actually quite aggressive on customer acquisition with the idea of keeping those customers post COVID-19. Make sure your e-commerce is really working well. Communicate with customers how they can safely transact with you, if that's curbside pickup, if that's home delivery,
right,
whatever that is. So
just the basic mechanics of how to do business with is kind of your foundation or your kind of your table stakes, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and we are seeing, because there has been a general pullback in advertising overall, we are seeing that for products people actually need, it's really quite effective on Facebook, on Google to be able to acquire customers currently, because people want and need those things. If you're not an essential service, and if you have seen a major degradation in your sales, this is a good time to keep in touch with your existing customers. Stay top of mind, again, from an interesting and entertainment sort of perspective, as opposed to perhaps a sales perspective. Because if you are a non-essential service, there's a good chance that people are saving their money, not looking to buy anything, particularly luxury goods right now. So trying to sell them something now might not be in your best interest. Now, having said that, I was just reviewing some very recent data that shows a bit of an uptick in general retail starting to occur in the last week or two, as you said it very well a second ago, Mike, where it's changing constantly and people are readjusting to this new normal. There was a huge shock to the system when COVID-19 first hit. Everyone is holding on to their cash, only buying toilet paper and hand sanitizer, right? So we are starting to see, though, trend lines where people are now realizing they need things like apparel has actually seen a slight uptick in terms of overall traffic all of a sudden.
Yeah. I know my wife is tired of looking at the same 4 sweatshirts. So speaking for myself, I'm out doing a bit of shopping online myself. She said, for God's sakes, would you buy a new sweatshirt? Because I'm tired of seeing the same ones.
Well, exactly. And interestingly, other categories like the toys category is up 22%, right? Because kids are at home.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I guess it makes sense, right? I mean, it's funny that you it's like looking at the data in the matrix, right? You see all this data, but until you start to parse it and start to think about consumer behaviors, and again, as we get into this over the shock, okay, this is life now. So how do we deal? I think there's opportunities for both, as you said, retention. I think it's a very savvy perspective. It's if you sell an item that maybe someone isn't going to buy today, but let's just keep in touch because you don't want to lose all that hard work. I know so many retailers put so much hard work into building their social communities. It's really not the time to leave those aside, right?
Yeah, and I think the best advice for any retailer that's seen a bit of a shock to sales is be ready for when consumers start to buy again. And I think it's going to be before we get out of COVID-19 because people will need things. Again, things that maybe they didn't need right when COVID-19 first hit. So make sure you have your e-com ready. Make sure you know how people can transact with you when they're ready.
Right.
Because I suspect as long as you're able to do digital ordering and fulfillment, there is an opportunity probably within the next few weeks where a lot of categories that right now are suffering are probably going to see a bit of an uptick.
Yeah, it's kind of I interviewed a gentleman named Frank Lavin, and he said, listen, if you can in bad weather, move. You got to move if you can. So what you're describing is, okay, let's get ready for when it comes back. Another data point, I was on a webinar yesterday, and Deborah Wiswig from based in China was saying how Hermes opened up their store and had their biggest one-day sales in their entire company history. There's a bit of pent-up demand. Now, where China is farther ahead of us in terms of coming out of COVID crisis, but it's just indicative of this countervailing. There's people who are struggling right now, for sure, and there's people who have pent-up demand. So it's really trying to figure out your particular segment, where they are, what they're looking at, and how they're feeling and getting ready for that, right?
Yeah, and I love that example. I got one more that retailers might find a little heartening, which is Comscore released some figures. They aggregated visits to Amazon, Target, Walmart, Costco, and Best Buy. This is obviously a U.S. stat, but they aggregated those huge retail websites, and there was a dip. Even for those guys, there was a dip right at the end of February, early March, pardon me. But since then, there's actually been a nice gradual increase. And if you compare the traffic for their sites versus when that dip hit, they were already up 11% just since then. So people are starting to adjust to the new normal. People do need to get some things that they require. So I do think we'll see a nice gradual emergence from the sort of cash hoarding and hunkered down sort of mentality as people start to see some light at the end of the tunnel.
I think what we have to watch out for as retailers is an increasing of the bifurcation. In other words, for small, mid-sized Main Street retailers, they can. I've always talked about, and you and I have talked about this before, this kind of leveling of the playing field, right? What you've been describing in the past few minutes in terms of, platforms is something that small and medium business can take advantage of today, because the big guys are just going to get bigger, I think. Certainly in the short term, you just described that, the 11% up, but it is still the opportunity. If you can move, in Ontario, you can do curbside across the country. Certainly shipping to the doorstep is possible. So I think there's opportunities, right, for all sizes of business to take advantage of these platforms, even if they haven't done so before. As you said, there's less people buying ads today, so maybe it's a little more affordable, makes a little more sense, right? Would you agree?
I would, and I actually think this is a wonderful time for, small to mid-sized retailers actually have some good success, as long as you can communicate clearly to people that here's how you can safely do business with us, make sure that you have the right tools in place, make sure you have the right communication methods in place. And my best advice to any retailer right now, whether you have sales or not, is be ready for when your customer is ready to buy. And that may be sooner than you think. So it's not all storm clouds right now. I think there is opportunity once your consumer is ready for your product.
Steve, how can listeners learn more about you, find out more about Reshift? How can they get in touch?
Well, you can always email me. I'm a bit of an email fiend, so you can get me at steve@reshiftmedia.com. Feel free to check out our website, reshiftmedia.com as well. And of course, they can go through you, Mike. You can get a hold of me anytime, of course.
The bat phone, the red hot line. Well, listen, Steve, thanks again for joining me on The Voice of Retail. I'm actually surprised this is your first appearance because you and I have been talking about this stuff for years. And again, you're certainly one of the top ranked speakers at Retail Council events, Retail Council Canada events. So glad to have you on. We'll get you back on later and kind of keep a track on this. But until then, stay safe. And once again, thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks to Lockie and Steve for being my guests in this episode. Now let's take a look at the top retail stories with Retail This Week for the week of April 17th, 2020. Not surprisingly, COVID stories dominate the news one way, shape, or another. We kick off with this from CBC. When grocery stores are the only game in town, even entrepreneurs turn employees. So this is the yin and yang of our current economy, where many are unemployed, record numbers are unemployed, but at the same time, retailers who are still essential, still operating, are looking for hundreds, if not tens of thousands of employees. So, the good news is that all these benefits, the CERB and all these things are kind of being calibrated so that, for example, in the next article, the federal emergency benefit is extended to those part-time and seasonal workers, so you can both get CERB and top up. And as Carl Littler said, this from the Globe Mail, Carl Littler from Retail Council of Canada has been on the podcast several times. It talks about, as great as the CERB was, it was sort of outbidding retailers for their own part-time workers. In other words, the $2,000 a month was outbidding for work because they couldn't top up with any of their part-time work. So that's a nice tweak to the program. Congratulations on Retail Council of Canada for working hard with our elected officials to kind of continue to tweak programs, and there's more of that to come. From the Calgary Herald, food supply fears turn shoppers to Calgary's community grocery stores. So, it is a point. I saw this ad from cartoon from one of the papers is the large stores are not the only destination that have food and groceries. The small niche specialty stores are there and eager for their business, eager for your business and available. Some quotes here from the Italian Center Shop president saying, we've never seen kind of this demand. We're ready. We've got pantry stable products, and we're supplied. So come shop with us. Thanks to some programs from the government. This is according to CTV News. Indigo is rehiring 545 workers following the layoff. So they've seen online their online channels experienced triple growth, and that was already a very strong business for Indigo. Ordered my own book actually this week from our friends at Indigo. This was a big week. My friend Steve Dennis launched his book, Remarkable Retail, this week. If you page back to January, I interviewed Steve at the NRF show. Seems like a long time ago. But look back for that podcast, great interview, and he previewed what was in the book that launched. And that book, while in the U.S. is not shipping because Amazon is prioritizing, it is certainly shipping in Canada. And I've placed my order already on Indigo. Sure, it will be in my mailbox soon, and look forward to reading that book. So, by the way, get out. It's going to be a vital book. Be sure and get that. That's Steve Dennis's great new book, Remarkable Retail. From Retail Insider, Craig Patterson's weekly or daily during the week, amid concerns of infection, Bank of Canada encourages retailers in Canada to accept cash. So this is one of those, a lot of retailers saying tap only, that's the safest thing. And, it's not like there's a million unbanked Canadians, so we don't want to be in a place where we're not taking cash. But as Carl Littler says, again, Carl's so active in the media, he's doing such a fantastic job. He said, listen, we can't control the fact that cash is going back and forth between people. It's not all fresh bills, so it does have to be wiped down, and you do have to be extra careful with it. So there you go. Great video, by the way, from Halifax with RCC's very own Jim Cormier, looking sharp as always, talking about the financial pressures. So he's talking about the troubling times for retailers, very eloquent or articulate, I should say. So check into that. The video that can be found in Retail This Week, and that can be found in the CTV News from Halifax. Canadian grocery industry demand continues to grapple. I think this is my fourth time we've had a story that is not dissimilar. It's just not giving up. There's a Metro spokesperson talking about, listen, every time we open up a slot for home delivery, it fills up. And that is certainly the case and will be the case for a while. Just these things don't happen overnight. Speaking of home delivery, there's some news from Sobeys and Globe Mail. Their results were, as you can imagine, their sales jump was amazing as people shifted from restaurant to shopping, but they also say they're now advancing the move of their home delivery launch, I should say, of their home delivery service, Voila, and begin testing the service in the GTA Greater Toronto area next week. I'm sure they wish they were in some kind of time tunnel and Voila was already up and going. But there you are. From the U.S. and international news, it starts off with these catastrophic results in the U.S., and I'm sure they're the same in Canada. Retail dropped 8.7%, and that's just the back half of March. So wait till you see April. A quote here from Sucharita Kodali, who will be my special guest. I've had Sucharita, had the pleasure of interviewing Sucharita a couple of times, even back in January at the NRF, but she's back on interviewing her tomorrow for an episode in the next week or two. Her quote, "It's pretty catastrophic drop-off in the back half of the month, but April may be one of the worst months ever. I mean, as she points out, it was an 8.7%, but the first couple of weeks of March weren't that bad. So wait till April. Speaking of catastrophic, JCPenney has skipped its $12 million interest payment as all their stores are closed. That goes into a 30-day grace period, which could be the end of JCPenney. On the other end of the scale, we have to talk about this, luxury versus value. French luxury brand Hermes pulls in $2.7 million in a single day at a single flagship store in China as the wealthy shoppers splurge after the coronavirus lockdowns. So something to look forward to, I suspect, here in Canada and the U.S. as well, as pent-up demand will eventually release in the months to come. From the Independent, and just trying to give a view as to different countries and where they are. In Austria, where they're starting to loosen up. Just because you build it, just because you loosen things up, don't expect people to come. So here they've started to loosen up and open shops, and nobody's showing up because basically they're just afraid to. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's this intersection of confident stores need to be open and people need to be confident to go to the stores. So we'll see how this all's play out. And then from CNBC, retailers face another challenge, handling returns. How do you handle returns in an era of COVID? Yet again, another historical trying to figure it out moment. For independent retailers peddling books to the masses, we've had a couple of great stories, particularly from the Vancouver booksellers, about how they're getting books around on bicycle and however they can. So it's great to see the independent bookstores rising to the occasion and getting support from their community. Just the COVID-19, this one, Business of Vancouver, permanently redraw the Robson retail landscape. I'm sure it's going to redraw many retail landscapes. I think of St. Catherine Street. I think of Bloor Street. I think of Queen Street. I think of, anyway, we can go on and on. Let's see. The emergency benefit doesn't fit everyone, and there's lots of work. This one, the Windsor Star. The Meg Watson, the owner of Francis Watson Independent Clothing Store, they kind of fit in between. It basically doesn't work for them. So they have a store, and in the store they put a sign, "SIBO won't save us," and the slogan is spawned a social media hashtag, SIBO won't save us. So there's a whole group of small independent retailers and others that just won't be saved by SIBO because it doesn't work for them. And SIBO is some of that small business loan and also some of the being able to afford employees. So anyway, we continue to work on that. I know the folks at Retail Council of Canada are listening and trying to work through adjustments to the programs to make sure we try and not leave anybody behind. What else we got? So speaking of Corona, as you know, the section here is on Corona strategies and what's happening. So we'll take a page from that. The New York Times, global trade sputters leaving too much here, too little there. So this is back to the supply chain implications of the coronavirus crisis. Good reading from the New York Times. From McKinsey, the future is not what it used to be. Thoughts on the shape of the next normal. That's good reading. Again, a good page through their strategy book. Printed store flyers may not come back. So Canadian Tire, one of many who have stopped distribution of their flyer. And we've been having flyer conferences for the past 10 years where people are saying flyers are done. It's all going to be digital. And maybe this is one of those moments where you're in a wormhole of time and suddenly this has happened. It'll be interesting to see if the printing presses start back up again for some of these flyers ever again because they've gone purely digital. I suspect they will, but probably not at the same pace. I think there'll be some learnings coming out of that, but it's hard to say there's learnings when the stores aren't open. They're not open in Ontario. They're not essential in Ontario. Canadian Tire stores I'm talking about. They do curbside and online delivery. So lots of things there in the mix. From Bain & Company, how to bounce back higher out of the recession. Takes a look at past companies who've done well and how coming out of recession, the Walgreens being the example here. There's some from the Visual Capitalist, which is this kind of news site that we've all kind of come across that takes data and puts it into a visual array. And this is how COVID has impacted media consumption. Kind of picking up on Steve Burrow's comments, dives a little bit, if not deeper, certainly a little more visually than our discussion. And then we look at Germany, who's starting to ease out of coronavirus lockdown, partial opening of shops and schools. Their opening shops up to 800 square meters allowed next week at car dealers, bookstores, but they have to have social distancing in place. So we'll see how all that rolls out in the fullness of time. Well, that's a wrap on this edition of The Voice of Retail. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple iTunes, your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review, and be sure to recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail industry. I'm Michael LeBlanc, founder and president of Emmy LeBlanc Company, Inc. You can learn more about me on www.emmyleblanc.co or, of course, on LinkedIn. Until next time, have a safe week.